Hey, what is going on, guys? Max Settings here, and welcome back to another review. So in today's review, we're going to be taking a look at the Hifiman Jade 2 Electrostatic headphones. This headphone is quite the controversial one right now on YouTube. Some of you may know why. But without getting into specifics, we are going to be taking a look at the Jade 2 and to see how it holds up to other electrostatic headphones and other headphones in general. And before we get started, I want to give a shout out to my friend Densetsu over at denfi.com. He sent these out for me to review. He is a spectacular photographer. Once again, I will link his website in the description. And if you're looking for any headphone or audio themed wallpapers, I would definitely recommend checking out his stuff because he has some spectacular photos. But anyway, let's get things going here with basic specs as always. So I was only sent the headphones. You can get just the headphones or you can get the system. So if you only want the headphones, they are $1,400. If you want the headphone and the amp, they are $2,500. And if you just want the amp, it is $1,600. So these are $1,400 pair of electrostatic headphones. So then after that, the specs that they give about the headphones: frequency response of 7 to 90,000 hertz, a variable bias of 550 to 650 volts, which is strange, and a weight of 365 grams. So Hifiman doesn't give too many specs on these headphones. But moving on into the build segment here, for those of you that saw my review of the Ananda, this is going to look pretty familiar because this headphone is basically just an electrostatic headphone in an Ananda shell. So same headband that's used on a lot of the new Hifimans, the Sundara, the new 560, the HE5SE, the Ananda, but this is the exact same one from the Ananda. Same metal up top with the comfort strap with the kind of alligator texture with the nubuck suede pattern on the bottom. Same plasticky kind of cups. Different grill design, this like honeycomb texture. Same massive pads, as you can see right there. And then the Jade 2, its coolest thing is its dust cover is this green purple pearlescent material that changes colors depending on how the light hits it. So you can see sometimes it's kind of green, sometimes it's kind of purple, and it's very, very neat, and it makes them look very cool. So that is really interesting and kind of cool with the Jade 2. And then attached cable, but for those of you that saw the Staxel 700 review, I was complaining that why do all electrostatics have to have ribbon cables? And Hifiman didn't do a ribbon cable on the Jade here. So let me grab the rest of it. So this is, I don't like this cable either, but this is just like that generic kind of plasticky cable, like sleeving material that's used like for any of you that are into computers, like, you know, like those cheap power supplies, they put like those colored wires inside, like this like plasticky junk. Like that's pretty much what this is. It's just this like plasticky stuff, and you can like push on it and make it like expand like that. And curiously, so like on the cost and the stacks, the ribbon cables, all the wires were all defined from each other. They all had their own paths in the rubber. But if you like push this thing apart, I don't know if it'll show up on camera, but you can see there's just random copper wires just flowing freely and like kind of twisted up and all curled around inside this jacket. So that's kind of interesting that they're not separated from each other like they are on other electrostatic headphones. And then as for comfort, this is the exact same thing as the Ananda, although I think they might be a little lighter than the Ananda. I don't remember the Ananda weight spec off the top of my head, but they feel definitely lighter, which I would sure hope so because there's no magnets in them. But the weight was never the problem with the Ananda. Once again, no cup swivel. This new Hifiman headband has no swivel in the cups. That's just flex in the chassis. And once again, Hifiman, do not keep using this headband. Please revert back to the old style headband. This one is not good. Same problem with people getting a seal because the cups angle backwards and you'll have a gap at the front. So once again, comfort would be good if they had swivel, but since no swivel, comfort is going to suffer and people are going to have trouble getting a seal on their head. Once I fed it with the shit Vidar, the speaker amp, they definitely became quite a bit better and didn't have as much problem with clipping. So I think these can take a little bit of power. They have a wide bias voltage range, which is kind of interesting. So just something I wanted to mention with the power on the Jade 2. So before we jump into the sound on the Jade 2 here, there is something I wanted to discuss. Now, the Jade 2 is commonly sold with its amplifier as a system. And I think that amplifier is the reason of much of the controversy surrounding this headphone. I've seen other reviews of the Jade 2 that say, with its stock amp, even pretty maxed out, it's not powering these loud enough. And these were at Can Jam New York this year that I was at. And I remember listening to them on the stock amp, and I didn't like them at all. And I know a lot of people that also hear them at Can Jam and shows who hear them on the stock amp share a similar opinion. So I think the stock amp of the Jade 2 is significantly limiting it. I think it's holding it back in power, so it's either lacking in voltage or current or something like that. So if you're interested in a Jade 2, I would forego its stock amp and get another amp, either some kind of converter like the IESL, or get a Stax amplifier or a KG-SSHV or something like that. So that being said, when I ran them on the IFI, the IESL, fed by the Vidar, because as I mentioned, the iCan was clipping a bit. When fed by the Vidar, I did not hate these headphones, which I know is going to be kind of interesting because most people really despise these things. But I think when they're fed by another amp that's not their amp, I think they actually have some potential. Now, that being said, I don't know if they're worth their price point, but you'll see here after we talk about the sound a little bit. So starting things off with the frequency response on the Jades. So these things have no sub bass at all. It just pretty much right around 80 or 90 hertz, it just drops off into oblivion. So no sub bass of these at all. It is not my seal because I've seen other measurements from people and listening tests. It doesn't have any sub bass in listening tests either. But between my measurements and other people like Oratory, the Jade 2 has no sub bass at all. After that, you have a very, very slight raise of around 100 to 120 hertz of about 2 dB. After that, the bass kind of flattens back out a little bit until around 1.5K, where there's a little bit of recession in the lower mids of around 2 or 3 dB as well. After that, your rest of your upper mids comes back up, or the lower part of your upper mids comes back in line pretty much. And then there is a pretty significant dip down in the mids of around 6K of about 4 or 5 dB. After that, the treble comes back up, back in line with where the lower mids were. And then after that, it kind of drops back off again right about 9K back into that 10K area. So these things have a relatively cohesive FR. It's honestly less strange than the COS E-Stats and the L700. It's fairly reminiscent of Hifiman FR, that slight recession in the mids with a treble that comes back up and kind of in line. It's not quite as elevated as it is on other Hifiman headphones, so it's not quite as V-shaped, but its biggest downfall is that really severe sub-bass roll-off. So, and then as for other things, so where these things really suffer is in dynamics. They are pretty thin sounding and don't have a very good macro dynamics. Now, I like these more than I like something like the Stax L300. They have some bass impact. They don't have no bass impact at all. So they have enough dynamics to have a little bit of thump, even though they don't have any sub bass. But they can thump a little bit in the mid bass. Not much, but they have something there that is acceptable. So they're definitely lacking in macro dynamics. And then as for speed, these things don't have the speed of an electrostatic headphones. They don't sound fast with that really quick speed that electrostatic headphones had, like the Stax or even the Koss had it more than the Jade 2 has. They don't sound like that really quick electrostatic kind of speed, even though they do sound quite thin. And then continuing on, timbre on them is actually surprisingly decent. It's definitely plasticky. It's not a great timbre, but it's honestly a better timbre than I think even the Koss and the Stax. It doesn't sound as unnatural as that. It sounds a lot more in line. It has a similar timbre to maybe something like the Sundara, like a very plasticky kind of timbre, but not insanely unnatural sounding like other E-Stat headphones. So that is quite good. And then detail-wise, they actually surprised me. For $1,400, whatever they are, yeah, they're not that level of detail. But I think for maybe like $500 or $600, maybe even $700 tops, I think these things actually can have that level of detail. Like they actually resolved surprisingly well, even comparing to the HD800 and the HE6 over here. So that was quite interesting that they resolved decently well. And then soundstage is not overly wide. They don't have a very wide soundstage, and imaging is pretty much average at best. So these things are kind of like, I don't know how I would want to put it, almost like an electrostatic Sundara, maybe with a little more detail and more sub-bass roll-off. Like that's kind of what they sound like. They don't sound like an electrostatic headphone to me. They sound much more like kind of like a lower end Hifiman planar, but just with more bass roll off. They just don't have those electrostatic properties. It doesn't have electrostatic timbre or speed, which I mean that kind of defeats the purpose of the electrostatic headphone, I guess. But your mileage may vary on that. So, and then as for comparisons, we have the HD800 and the HE6 here with now with the Audeze LCD4 headband, and the pads that are currently on it are the Mr. Speakers ether pads. So I compared to these two because the HD800 new was the same price as the J2, $1,400-ish. And I didn't initially consider comparing to the HE6 because the HE6 has weird amp requirements, but then I realized that this is an electrostatic headphone, so it also has weird amp requirements. So that's why we were going to compare this to the HE6. I'm probably not normally going to compare the HE6 to most headphones because this thing has quite the added amp cost. But for an E-Stat, I think that's fair because the E-Stats also do. So the HD800 is a lot more dynamic. It's wider. It has more detail. Timbre is different. Still not great timbre, but definitely a better headphone overall than the J2, and used way cheaper than the J2. Even J2 used is going like $1,100-$1,200. So yeah, HD800 is definitely going to take over J2. And then HE6 was also more dynamic, more detail, although this is still lagging behind HD800 a little bit in detail. The timbre on this is better, and the HE6 is overall a better headphone, especially if you can amp them properly. So those are kind of the two things that I would compare to. So the Jade 2 is an interesting one here because I don't hate it, but at the same time, I don't know what I would take it over. Because even if it was like half its price, like $700, I'm still going to take a Focal Lex or an LC2 or something. It has some interesting properties, but I just don't see the draw or why you'd want to own this headphone, especially when you have to invest in an amp. And like I already mentioned, the stock amp is not good. So I just don't see their place in the market at all. I mean, maybe if they were like $500 and came with like a smaller amp that was acceptable, like maybe compared to the Koss E-Stats, they would be kind of interesting. But they don't have E-Stat qualities, and they're really compressed sounding with the bass roll-off. So even though they have like more bass than something like a Sundara, or sorry, more detail than something like a Sundara, the bass roll-off is just too much, and their dynamics are poor. So I just don't see where they fit in. So I don't dislike them per se, but I just don't see that their place in the market, or why you would want this over other things. So in conclusion, the Jade 2 is very pretty. It has some interesting things going on. Once again, Hifiman, please switch back to the old headband. This headband sucks. Build quality is okay well, it's actually pretty good for a stat. All metal, unlike the L700 and the cost. This is the best stat that I've reviewed, or best built stat that I've reviewed. But the sound is just not quite there. Even with not its stock amp, which does improve it greatly, I just don't see its place in the market or why you would want this thing. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed my review of the Hifiman Jade 2. If you want to buy this headphone, links of where to get it in the description. And once again, shout out to Densetsu for sending this out. And I believe he's actually selling this headphone, so if he is all listed, I'll put his eBay listing in the description. Links to the MiniDSP EARS graph of these, as well as my Twitter and my contact email, and all other relevant information down in the description. But anyway, guys, thanks for watching. Look forward to seeing you in the next review. Bye.